Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. The death toll from those tornadoes Friday and Saturday has reached 37 in 5 states. Preliminary counts estimate 74 tornadoes touched down in the Midwest over those 2 days. And Mitt Romney has won the Washington State Caucus. The state party announcing last night Romney took 38% of the vote, with Ron Paul at 25%, beating Rick Santorum by a hair at 24% for second place. We will get to the Republican contest in just a moment, but right now, joining me today, we have returning to the program Congressman Steve Cohen, Democrat from Tennessee, Michelle Barnard, founder of the Barnard Center for Women, Politics, and Public Policy, former president of the conservative Independent Women's Forum, Goldie Taylor, author of the forthcoming book, An Uncivil War, and John McWhorter, professor of Linguistic and American Studies at Columbia, as well as a contributor at The New Republic and TheRoot.com, and a regular guest here and a fellow dad of a newborn. All right. We were commiserating about sleeping schedules in the green room. Yes, it's very important. We're just a couple of days away from Super Tuesday, with primaries and caucuses in 11 states and 424 delegates at stake. Voters in states including Ohio, Massachusetts, Tennessee will choose more delegates than have been awarded so far. I think we're well past the giddy exuberance phase of the early GOP primary with a shiny new frontrunner each week. We're now into the desultory middle stretch. No one is ready to throw in the towel, but a feeling of malaise hangs over the race. Newt Gingrich is a sideshow, campaigning primarily to win his home state of Georgia. And Rick Santorum keeps getting poleaxed by organizational issues. In Virginia, with 46 delegates at stake, neither Santorum nor Gingrich is even on the ballot. So Tuesday is a big day, one of several still to come for Republican candidates. Illinois and Pennsylvania are weeks away, and California, with 172 delegates, doesn't vote until June. As Donald Rumsfeld once said about another long, awful engagement, one way or another, it will be a long, hard slog. All right. I want to read this quote by George Will. Because I think you can feel a little panic surfacing among conservatives and Republican commentators right now. And the panic has to do with this fundamental indecision, and that is operating, I think, on 2 levels. The base clearly cannot get enthusiastic about Mitt Romney. We've known that for a very long time, but I think there was a sense that Republicans tend to fall in line, right? There's that Bill Clinton line that Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line. Of course, the tradition of the Republican nominating contest has been getting the person who's next in line, marshaling enthusiasm for Bob Dole in 1996, right? Or John McCain in 2008. That falling in line hasn't happened. And we could talk about part of the reasons. We're going to talk with Michael Steele in a little bit about the rules that may have made that more difficult. And then there's the fact that even, I think, the party establishment can't really get itself excited about Mitt Romney because they just don't think he's that great a candidate. I mean, he hasn't shown himself to be a particularly gifted politician, I think, over the course of this campaign. So here's George Will. It seems to me essentially waving the white towel. There would come a point when, taking stock of reality, conservatives turn their energies to a goal much more attainable than, and not much less important than, electing Romney or Santorum president. It is the goal of retaining control of the House and winning control of the Senate. Basically saying, you guys, we have screwed this up irrevocably. Michelle Barnard, do you agree with that?
I don't want to say that I necessarily agree, but I will say, if I were, as a member of the voting public, if you're looking at the Republican candidates right now, you have to be scratching your head and saying, what exactly do we do? I mean, conventional wisdom is that the Republican candidates are making things look better and better for Barack Obama. And I probably would say that conventional wisdom in this case is probably very, very correct. Mitt
One of the rare instances.
Mitt Romney is not appealing to the base. I would say, though, on something in favor of Mitt Romney is the fact that we haven't seen race baiting with him. We have not seen him engage in any sort of negative rhetoric when it comes to race, ethnicity, religious background. I don't think we're going to see that.
Well, I think you're right. But for I think the way that he's handled the illegal immigration issue has been quite demagogic. If not specifically in a kind of racial register, subtextually, I think obviously the appeal that he's made on cracking down on illegals and so forth.
Michelle, are you somebody who would prefer to see him as president if you had a choice among the Republican candidates?
No,
Romney?
I have to tell you that I am somebody who is a diehard Barack Obama fan, and if I were a Republican and I were going to be voting the Republican, I'm an independent. If I were a Republican and I was going to be voting in the Republican primary, Mitt Romney would be the person I would vote for.
And you also, I mean, you have an interesting political trajectory, right? I mean, you had been at Independent Women's Forum. You've sort of now have carved out a political identity that is independent of the conservative movement, but you were part of the conservative movement before, right? I mean, you're our Tiresias today.
Yes,
right? You have seen things from both sides.
I'm one of the people who has been to both dark sides on the Democratic Party, Republican Party. I'm also probably one of the members of the growing part of the American public that really is saying a pox on both of your houses. I don't like the Democratic Party.
Some more conventional wisdom.
You know, I don't like the Republican Party. It is conventional wisdom. Yeah. You have to court me as a voter. You have to, it's sort of a female thing. Court me. Explain to me why I should vote for you and what it is you're going to do for me.
Well, and I want to talk more about that because we're going to talk about polarization, particularly the dynamics of it. As Congressman, that's something you see every day in your working environment, I imagine. But I want to play this clip. Last night, Mike Huckabee had a forum, a presidential forum. And one of the things I think is so fascinating about the trajectory over of the race the last 3 weeks is all of a sudden the economy started to get good, or at least promising signs came in quick succession, enough to convince people that we were on a trajectory that was encouraging, right? Even if where we are right now.
The worst is over.
The worst is over, and we saw the campaign and the political conversation in the country turn entirely away from the economy. And it's really quite bizarre. We're going to talk about Senator Fluke and Rush Limbaugh, but
bizarre is a nice way of putting it, Chris.
Yes, well, bizarre and sort of that's right, kind of ghastly, actually.
Yeah, it's very scary.
Yes, ghastly, offensive, and bizarre.
Yes.
So here's Mike Huckabee has a forum last night, and what was funny about the forum was it was not funny, but the setting was a plant that had closed down, a DHL plant that closed down in Ohio. So in some ways, the subtext of it was Mike Huckabee gathering the candidates together to be like, yo, idiots, economy. Remember economy? Like putting them in the empty factory. And I thought this moment from a college student asking Rick Santorum a question perfectly captured the dynamic that has been so destructive to the Republicans, which is this competing to be more conservative, to be more extreme than your competitor, where Rick Santorum was doubling down on the point where people shouldn't go to college, right? He sort of backed himself into this ideological cul-de-sac, and he couldn't get out, and here he is being confronted on it.
My question is about your comments you said earlier this week. I'm a student in college, and your comment about, Obama being a snob for wanting everyone to have the chance to go to college didn't really sit well with, my campus.
Sure.
So I wanted to, to give you a chance to explain what you meant by that, because personally I'd really like to know.
We need to encourage different paths that meet the needs of the people individually, and it's this attitude that that government knows best for everybody, and we're going to set this template, which was what I was rejecting to as sort of elitist type of behavior.
So elitist kind of behavior. Michelle, you see?
I'm appalled at it, particularly coming from someone who has given us the impression that he is speaking for the underclass. He is speaking for people who want to reach the American dream, for people who want to be Horatio Alger. Anyone will tell you that if you want a shot at the American dream, if you want to be able to be prepared for the 21st century workforce, what parent doesn't want their child to go to college?
Oh, no.
It's ridiculous. And doesn't Rick Santorum have an undergraduate degree? I believe he has an MBA.
Yes, of course he does,
He is homeschooling his children. Why is it elite to say, I want my child to go to college?
Now, I really wish he hadn't put these things the way he did. But I think Santorum and Obama this week came to a certain agreement. The idea is maybe to go to college, 4 years of college, but also maybe to have some sort of probably 2-year or 1-year vocational education in a community college. The idea being not to teach people that the only way to being middle class and having the American dream is to go to college for 4 years.
I don't think that they came to an agreement at all. I think President Obama said from the outset that college should be an opportunity, that vocational schools an opportunity, military training an opportunity, that people should have access to a full menu of opportunities, including a 4-year college. I think Santorum came back, took that out of context, pulled something from it, and distorted and destroyed it, and backed himself into his own.
And let the record reflect that the lone academic at the table is the one warning people away from foreign institutions. You can take that as you will.
I made a peculiar choice, but I am very interested in somebody learning how to do something with their hands. Often they will make more money than I do. Well, and I just think we shouldn't lose that part of the conversation.
Well, I really don't. The military was my choice. I mean, I did not have access coming out of high school to a 4-year institution. Many of the kids in our family did not. So I went to the Marine Corps, which then in turn contributed to my college education. I think these the access or the avenue up. That is the American dream. And any conservative who denies that ought to be questioned on it.
And what I thought was interesting was that it raised this issue, Congressman, about higher education. And, you know, one of the most interesting things about the way higher education has gone in this country is that we had this huge spike in college attainment, particularly from the post-war period. We all know about the GI Bill. And then, since then, the amount of graduates of four-year institutions as a percentage of the population has remained steady, but the amount of people attending college, it keeps going up. And the wedge between the two are people not completing the 4 years. That increasingly, we keep putting more inputs into the college system, but we are not getting any more outputs of it. And I think if you view a machine in that respect, there is something that isn't working, right?
Well, there's problems with that, and kids go and they don't necessarily graduate in 4 years or graduate at all. That's where we're losing to the Chinese and everywhere else. We need more people and more engineers and more people in the STEM programs. Mm-hmm. And unless we do that, we're not going to catch up with our trade and with our production and in all ways.
Science, technology, education, engineering, and math, which is something the president has put a tremendous amount of emphasis on. All right, Rick Santorum looked like he was sort of cruising into front-runner status. He lost in Michigan. We're setting up for Tuesday. And we want to know, and this is such a basic question, who is winning the GOP race?
Barack Obama.
But I mean, even within the primary system, with the rules of the game and the 1,144 delegates that must be attained, it is like sitting in a stadium where the scoreboard is blocked out. So we're gonna talk about what the actual score in the Republican primary race is. Nobody actually knows, and that's next. All right, so what should you know for the week coming up? You should know we'll find out this coming Friday how many jobs the economy added in February, data that was delayed a week later than its usual release. You should know that in order to get back to full employment, the economy will need to add an estimated 440,000 jobs per month for the next 3 years. You should know that in just under an hour from now, the president will be addressing the AIPAC conference, where he will discuss the U.S.'s relationship to Israel and the possibility of a preemptive Israeli attack on Iran. You should know that in an interview this week, the president said it is, quote, unacceptable for Iran to have a nuclear weapon. You should also know that there remains no definitive evidence that Iran is in fact building a nuclear weapon. You should know they remain a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Israel is not a signatory to. And you should know the president's own chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, has said an Israeli attack on Iran would be, quote, destabilizing. Melissa Harris-Perry will be carrying some of the speech live right after Cory Booker, so definitely stick around for both of those. And you should know the next week we'll be devoting a whole lot of time to looking at our relationship to Israel and what impacts it has both abroad and in our politics here at home. You should know the Florida Restaurant and Lodging Association is pushing a bill that would slash the minimum wage of waiters and other tipped employees more in half from $4.65 an hour to just $2.13 an hour. You should know the Florida Department of Economic Opportunity estimates the median income for full-time servers in the state is just over $18,000, so you should know it's not exactly like the state servers are raking in the dough. You should know that one of the restaurants supporting this move is Outback Steakhouse, and you should know that the owner of Outback Steakhouse is an investor group, including none other than, drumroll, Bain Capital. You should know lower wages for workers likely mean more money in the pockets of Bain execs. You should know the House of Representatives will not be voting on a highway bill next week after all. You should know the bill, as Congressman Cohen told us, is usually a relatively bipartisan piece of legislation, the result of a fair amount of horse trading, but it has been turned, as everything has, into a partisan cudgel this year, as the House has proposed, among other things, a provision approving the Keystone XL pipeline. You should know Republican Secretary of Transportation Ray LaHood, who used to serve in the House, called the House GOP version of the bill the most partisan ever and, quote, the worst bill in decades. And you should know the path forward for a full 5-year reauthorization of legislation that pays for our roads and transportation infrastructure is now sucked down into the void of Republican obstruction. You should know there are a total of 424 delegates at stake in the 11 states that vote on Super Tuesday. But you should also know that the actual delegate tallies up to now remain remarkably, maddeningly opaque, as many states have not yet had the conventions necessary to award their delegates. You should know the rules guiding this process were written by Republicans in individual states, and you should know many Republican bigwigs have come to the conclusion that the new rules are an unmitigated disaster. You should know Tuesday is going to be a long night for campaigns, journalists covering those campaigns, and for political junkies watching until the polls close. That's because Alaska, polls don't close until 12 midnight East Coast time. You should know, for those politics junkies, Alaskan politics nerds, and insomniacs, I will be hosting special late-night coverage of the Super Tuesday results right here on MSNBC, so tune in. My guests are going to come back and tell us what they think we should know this week right after this. All right, our guests are back to tell us what we should know as the news unfolds this week. I will begin with Congressman Steve Cohen from Memphis, Tennessee. What should we know?
Well, you actually summarized the transportation bill, which is a major issue. But AIPAC will be coming to Washington, and the president will address the group. Prime Minister Netanyahu will be there, too. So I think issues in Washington will be early focused on Iran and Israel, and that always conjures up gas prices, as does the transportation bill with the Keystone XL. It's false for people to think or to listen to any kind of hooey that the failure to pass Keystone XL has anything to do with the rise in gas prices, or that the president or Steve Cohen can control it. We can control it just as much as Chris Hayes or Rush Limbaugh. Gas prices, a lot of it's oil speculators, and we should do something about oil speculators and put a limit to what they can do, and it's wrong to put that gas price. And the other thing I want people to know is they prepare their taxes. There have been a lot of scams and tax programs around the nation, particularly in the minority community. The IRS will help you prepare your taxes for free. You don't have to hire somebody who may not give you back your tax refund. Go to the IRS.
Well, that's some servicey, that's service there right there.
Absolutely.
Go to the IRS. Michelle Barnard, what should folks know?
Folks should know that March is International Women's Month, Women's History Month. It's a very, very important month, as we have seen over the last week. Going into the next couple of weeks, people should remember that women matter, the women's vote matters, and to look for something really interesting in the footsteps of Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and Susan B. Anthony. The Barnard Center for Women Politics and Public Policy, the Connecticut Parents Union, and Michelle Rhee of Students First will be doing something very big, talking about women and education reform throughout the month of March.
We have not done a lot on education reform, and I put that in quotes because that even the term reform is contested. Who gets to call themselves a reformer? And
I get to call myself a reformer.
I have strong feelings about Michelle Rhee, which I won't share right now. But Goldie Taylor, what should you know?
I think that people should know that, contrary to popular belief, Barack Obama is not more conservative than Bill Clinton. I think from the outset of the Clinton administration, when he came in and abandoned middle-class tax cuts, abandoned economic stimulus, the reworking of welfare reform, all of those things really put him to the right of Barack Obama. And I think that's the reason why this president will consolidate and win this fall. So people should know that Barack Obama is in a very strong position for re-election.
Yeah, I was on it. It's very hard to figure out how you score ideology over time, and there's actually a metric for this called DW nominate, which is the metric that we used in the chart that we showed on polarization. But it's harder for presidents because presidents don't take votes, right? So the DW nominate is based on congressional votes that you're doing all the time, and so it's a much harder scoring process.
Three strikes put more African American men in jail than almost anything for life.
John McWhorter, what should people know as we go into this week?
Well, Robert Caro's series of biographies of Lyndon Johnson is about to finish up. And as odd as it may seem for me to bring that up on this show, that book, that series, is a must-read for all Americans. And I'm bringing it up now in light of our discussion and talking about the impending departure of Olympia Snow, to say that if you get through those books, not only will it change your life...
It's about 1,800 pages total.
It's a long series, but it will show you that stasis in Congress is a norm in the United States, and when things move further and you get the beautiful music, that is something unusual.
We
can't expect it all the time. So think about Robert Caro's book, read it, and get a sense of what America unfortunately really is about.
The 3-volume biography, I believe, is called...
4 now.
4 volumes.
Fourth one's
right. Oh, well, I guess I've gone through 3, so I have one more to go. I want to thank my guests today, Democratic Congressman Steve Cohen from Tennessee, Michelle Barnard of the Barnard Center for Women Politics and Public Policy, Goldie Taylor, author of the forthcoming book An Uncivil War, and Columbia professor John McWhorter, also from the New Republic and TheRoot.com. Thank you all, and thank you for joining us. We'll be back next weekend, Saturday and Sunday at 8 Eastern Time. We'll have Mike Daisey with us, the creator of The Agony and Ecstasy of Steve Jobs, and we'll look at President Obama's meeting tomorrow with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and America's relationship with Israel. You can get more info about next week's show by checking in with us online at up.msnbc.com. Up next is Melissa Harris-Perry, and we'll see you next week here on Up.
The political system here in Washington, where it's dysfunctional and the political paralysis has overtaken the environment to the detriment of the good of this country.
That's Olympia Snow explaining to my colleague Andrea Mitchell earlier this week about why she decided not to seek re-election. Surprised Washington. We set up the show to talk about sort of more in the middle, and now midstream I've decided that I want to bury the middle because I'm here with all these people defending independence and centrism, blah blah blah. So, but that quote from Olympia Snow was so interesting to me because I remember during the healthcare debate, when the Affordable Care Act was getting pushed. And Congressman, you were in the House during that time.
Great day.
And but during that whole process, I remember thinking to myself, what I would give to be Olympia Snow. When she's talking about how you can't get anything done, Olympia Snow literally could have gone to the White House and just written out a list of demands and said, you will get my vote if you do the following. There was no one else in America at that period of time with more power and more control over the Affordable Care Act than Olympia Snow. So for her to turn around and be like, well, you can't get anything done and complain just seems so disingenuous. If anyone in Congress has power, right, with a Democratic president, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate that was short of a filibuster clearing vote by essentially your vote, then it's you.
And the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. She and I think Senator Collins had a lot of influence on that, too. They needed the 60 votes.
Yeah. So
But, I think it's fascinating. But one of the things that I keep wondering is if when you look at, there is no poll that you can look at where you don't see that the approval ratings for Congress are dismally low. And when you look at those polls, one of the things you have to keep asking yourself is then, with the exception of you, of course, why do they keep getting reelected?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's really the irony of this. And I look at what's happening has happened with Olympia Snow. And on behalf of the American people, you really have to mourn the fact that there is no room for someone like Olympia Snow in the U.S. Congress.
But isn't it also the fact that Maine is going to replace Olympia Snow with? Sorry, go ahead, Goldie.
I'm not for bipartisanship's sake. Sometimes
I think that's a really good point.
Stupid ideas that just should not ever come to roost.
Right.
I think I'm mourning the death of reason. And sort of these big polarized divides that just don't let the truth and reason just win out. Whatever happened to good old-fashioned common sense?
And doing
birth control is preventative health.
Right.
Why are we voting on, if someone had told me about the aspirin between the knees, I wouldn't have 5 kids. But, the truth is issues like that come up because reason has... is walking itself to the graveyard.
But I guess that's exactly. I'm so glad you said that point because to me, I think don't trust the fact that the process of sort of centrist-based kind of horse trading produces reason more reliably than the contentious rigor of...
there's a difference.
I'm not a centrist. Yeah. I'm not a weak-kneed moderate. Right. I'm a frickin' angry independent, which says I'm going to take the best thing that I see that works for me and my community and my neighborhood and my state that raises quality of life for us. I think that is very different from being this kind of wishy-washy, toe-the-line. Right. I'm voting on issues. I'm not voting on people. I'm not voting on party.
Reason is so elusive, though.
Yeah.
And I think part of what democracy is about is something very unpretty and very unfrustrating, especially to people who consider themselves educated, which is that people see reason as completely different things, and it's very difficult for people of all levels of intelligence and education to be brought to reason, such that maybe something that we could all possibly call reason is something that comes forth maybe every 30 or 60 years, and we think of the New Deal and we think of the Great Society, but most of the time, what we're going to see is a partisan kind of mess, and it's frustrating. But I'm not sure what other model of governance we could have.
And I think what the final point I want to make on this is that we're trying to. I think the national conversation does tend to be so sort of histrionic and so polarized and so sort of caught up in the outrage cycle, right? But the other fact is that politics is about conflict. Fundamentally, it is about conflict, and it will never stop being about conflict. And there's always this kind of wish that comes in from people that are so sort of bummed out by the conflicted nature of politics. That's what politics is. And you know what? For hundreds of thousands of years, human beings have killed each other in the streets over the fact that they have different interests, and we've created this amazing system that avoids that. And in some ways, I want to celebrate that. What you should know for the Newsweek coming up next. Most of us thought the winner of the Republican primary race would be a foregone conclusion at this point. We thought we could depend on fundraising totals and polls to tell us the score. But it looks like it could be 2008 all over again when we all started counting delegates painstakingly state by state until challenger Barack Obama overwhelmed the presumed establishment runner Hillary Clinton. It's like you're watching a baseball game where both teams are scoring runs, and when you look up at the scoreboard in the 7th inning, it's blacked out because no one can agree on who has what delegates. And the rules are opaque, to say the least. Rick Santorum was irritated when the Michigan Republican Party voted to break a delegate tie Wednesday, giving 16 delegates to Mitt Romney and 14 to Santorum.
I just think that you really see what the Romney campaign's all about. Anything to win, after the fact, break the rules, rewrite the rules. That's not the way Republicans and conservatives do it. But he He's new to the conservative cause, so I'm not surprised he doesn't know that.
Ouch. We've been talking about this fact that it's very hard to get consensus. If you go to the AP and CNN, our own numbers, I tend to trust our own numbers because the person who does it here has been doing this forever and is an incredible guru. I had a conversation with him yesterday and he knows every granular fact about which delegate got awarded and what.
One of those people.
Yes, but we were talking about the delegate rules. I thought, oh man, that is so boring. I don't want to listen about delegate math. But then, when you dive into it, what the rules of a primary process are this fascinating contested site of a battle between two sort of forces. It used to be that the party establishment just chose the nominee. They chose them essentially, literally, right behind closed doors and smoke-filled rooms. And then the modern primary system came about in the 1960s, and that power sort of devolved down out into actual voters and party activists and donors. And then there was concern, particularly in the 60s and 70s, and particularly on the Democratic side, that too much control had gone out that way, right? McGovern had been nominated and everybody freaked out. And so there was this wrenching back. And so the rules that get written to kind of guide the nomination process end up being a way to essentially adjudicate this battle between the sort of party establishment and the grassroots. And we're seeing a kind of stalemate, I think, right now being drawn between those two forces. Congressman Cohen, you lived through 2008, right?
I'm here.
Yes, you managed to survive. But that must have been difficult because that was, remember we had the whole superdelegate question, right? And the superdelegates, you yourself are a superdelegate because you are a member of Congress.
Superdelegate.
Yes. You left your cape in the green room, but
bound to strong.
But that was
tall buildings.
That was the idea of the superdelegates, right? Was to create this sort of check, right, on the party's base, that there would be these sort of
there'd be people that have knowledge of the political process and what you need to win, and the idea that winning would be the ultimate goal. I mean, the activists are all concerned about issues, which is important, and their own issues, and they can be diverse from social issues to economic issues or whatever. But the senior policy people are supposed to be looking at what makes sense, how can we win, that's the ultimate goal. And the activists sometimes lose sight of that. So, yeah, it's a good mixing of the sides of politics. It's kind of like your software and your hardware.
Right. Congressman Cohen, wouldn't you say that really we're just seeing how the sausage gets made? And so in the grand old days, you would have had partisan people, the sort of people you now see on YouTube. They were in the smoke-filled room, and they got shouted down, and there were people who were more practical. And that's what came out of things in the grand old era when, for example, a Republican would be somebody who today we would think of as a progressive. Now, with technology and other developments, we get to see the people who are on the sides making a lot of noise, being less reflective. And eventually what happens is that the Democrats turn to somebody like Clinton. The Republicans now are at a point where they're going to have to start making that kind of decision. Do the crazies and the anti-intellectuals and the media baiters have anything that we could think of right now as some sort of long-term threatening impact, or is it really just that they will be shouted down and the Republicans will come to their senses? You're on the ground. What do you think about the true danger of these people?
There's a danger to the Republican Party because they've gone so far right that they're not and realistically looking at winning. Who's going to be the nominee? I don't know, but I can tell you Rick Santorum's not going to be president.
No.
Ron Paul, who's a delightful gentleman, is not going to be president.
People don't like that.
And Mitt Romney's not going to be president. But he may be the Republican nominee, and what they're doing is they're like fighting to win the nomination, and the seniors are knowing the ultimate goal is not to win the nomination, but to win the White House. Mm-hmm. Right, and right now they don't have somebody.
So let me also push back on just the notion of the crazies. I mean, I think you were saying that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, right? Yes. But I mean, the people that supported Howard Dean were in 2004 were the crazies, right? But they were supporting him because the war was a completely horrendous bankrupt enterprise the entire Democratic establishment had gone along with, and also let's not remember that the Achilles heel of John Kerry was the quote, "I voted for it before I voted against it," right? And that was precisely what Howard Dean zeroed in on. So I'm not even sure, I'm saying this now as sort of analogical argument on the left, but I'm not even sure that the party establishment is any more trustworthy on these sort of metrics.
Well, I don't think they are. I think the English dissenters got onto the Mayflower. They hopped the ship because they were the crazies and because they wanted a voice in how they were going to be governed. And I think what we're seeing now is that, infused with technology, social networks, Twitter, the YouTube, in any way that consumers or public can really get engaged and change this process. I think that is for the good. Anytime you got them in the back room making the decision and coming out with a nominee, that's a really bad thing, and they're no more thoughtful than the rest of us.
Let's ask one of the actual gatekeepers. In fact, the person who oversaw the rule writing, MSNBC political analyst Michael Steele joins us now from Washington. As chairman of the Republican National Committee, he oversaw the changes in the rules of this year's delegate selection. Michael, welcome.
Call me crazy, baby. How you doing?
I would never call you crazy, Mr. Steele.
Crazy like a fox. Crazy like a fox.
Well, that's you. You can now make the case. You have the opportunity to make that case. Here's what I'd like you to describe to us. There were rule changes that were created in the wake of 2008, and my understanding was there was a feeling on the Republican side that John McCain sewed up the nomination too quickly, and that actually the long contested primary on the Democratic side, which at the time everyone was worried about, was actually to the party's benefit, and the rules were changed with an eye towards moving the contest in that direction. Is that the case?
That you've just summed it up perfectly, and that was exactly the analysis that came out of the 2008 primary. By this time in 2008, our nominee was decided. It was John McCain, and for the next 6-7 months, he was virtually ignored by the press. There was virtually no news out of the campaign. The focus, the energy, the emphasis was on the Democratic side in a hotly contested race, and so we saw this split screen, if you will, where there was activism, the base sort of coming together, rallying around one or both of the candidates in some form. And on the other side, folks were kind of sitting there going, all right, here we go. Okay, well, when is the convention? And so when they got to Minnesota, they decided that they wanted, in between the 2008 and 2012 convention, for the next chairman, to take a look at the process and to see how we can improve upon it. And what we came up with was a system in which we would elongate this a little bit to allow the underdogs, the grassroots activists, the candidate who doesn't have all the money, who doesn't have the infrastructure necessarily, but may have the message, to rise up through this process if that message resonates. And it sort of leveled the playing field a little bit, frustrates the heck out of the establishment types, particularly the Romney crew, who are now complaining about this is too long, and you had the Chris Christie comment saying, well, whoever thought of this was silly. Yeah, it's silly because your guy isn't getting the nomination in February.
No one likes the rules when they're losing.
Exactly.
I want you to actually walk us through what those concrete changes were, and whether you think this has worked out, and what unforeseen challenges have arisen right after we take this break, right when we come back. We have Michael Steele here via satellite from Washington, D.C., the man who oversaw the rule-writing process that has given us today's Republican primary race, so you can send your thank you notes to him. Michael, I guess the question is, so there were a few things that the rules did. One was they created this April date before which we're going to be, you had to be proportional, right, if you're going to be before that. They tried to stretch out the calendar and stop all the states from crowding into the early phases, although a lot of the states went ahead, like Florida, and did it anyway, and they got penalized half their delegates. Has the system worked as you intended in terms of the rule changes?
Yeah, I think it has, except for the little Florida hiccup and a few others that have jumped the gun. There are two rules that are operational here. Rule 16, which is the penalty rule that says if you break a rule, you lose half your delegates. So Florida, in breaking the rules by jumping before April 1st, lost half of its delegates. Rule 15, which is the operational rule with respect to the allocation of those delegates, says whatever number of delegates you have, whether you have 100 or you lose half of them, you have 50, those delegates, if you go before April 1st, will be applied proportionally. So this Tuesday, everyone's talking about Super Tuesday. What a grand opportunity it's going to be for Mitt Romney to sew it up. Well, not so much, because all of those delegates, except for 2 states, are going to be awarded proportionally. Vermont and Virginia are winner-take-all, which will be an advantage for Romney, particularly in Virginia with 46 delegates. And while the other 2 aren't contesting there, he's going to have a chance to whip up 46 delegates, presumably he wins. But the rest of the states on Tuesday night are going to be proportional, which means that everyone has a chance to continue to play, which was the whole point.
Well, I'm glad you pointed out this, got into the weeds a little bit here, because it points to something. No, believe me. We got 2 hours to talk about Rule 15 and Rule 16. They're on the edge of their seats at home.
Sounds like one of our meetings.
What's that? But what you said points out this very important distinction between, we can look at what the vote tallies are, right? So let's say Mitt Romney ekes out a disappointing victory over Ron Paul in Virginia by 1,000 votes. Okay? He's still going to bank 45 delegates. And if Rick Santorum even wins in Ohio, right, but he wins by an hour enough, he may not bank any delegates. So there is a gap between what the sort of actual vote totals are in the delegates. And here's Ron Paul's chief delegate counter, Doug Weed, talking to my colleague Rachel Maddow about precisely this phenomenon.
All right. I watch television and I see him saying Romney has this many delegates and Santorum this many delegates. And as you know, not a single delegate has been awarded from Iowa or Minnesota or Missouri or Colorado or Nevada. We're tracking this at the precinct level. We think we have the majority of them. We think we've won in Iowa, we won in Minnesota, we won in Colorado, and Missouri's yet to be seen. And we think we probably won in Nevada because we're counting the precinct votes.
So the point here being that the states that have awarded their delegates through caucuses, in most cases, not in all, but in most cases, those delegates haven't been awarded yet, right?
That's right.
And there's a variety of processes and sort of levels of caucusing that has to happen before they are awarded, which means that committed activists like those that support Congressman Ron Paul could come away with more delegates than it looked like they had when we came out of the voting.
That's absolutely right, and that's the sort of quirkiness of a caucus, is that a lot of people, particularly in the media, gets hyped up about Iowa on caucus night,
right.
But that's just a beauty contest. Effectively, it's just sort of okay, check the pulse of folks and how do they feel. Those delegates won't be awarded until they go to their convention this spring, and they have their primary after the fact. Yeah,
Congressman Cohen saying it's hard to call Iowa a beauty contest.
Point taken, Congressman.
Michelle Barnard, I've got a question for you. Isn't it really? I mean, if it seems to me that this really all boils down to delegates, but there's this question of perception as well. If you go back to 2008, for example, and you look at Ohio and you look at Georgia in the Democratic primary contest, Hillary Rodham Clinton actually received more of the popular vote than Barack Obama did, but he got more delegates than she did.
And that happened in a number of places.
It happened in a number of places. There was a lot of excitement. I mean, I frankly like this process because we can, who would have thought that we would have gone from the economy, for example, to talking about aspirin between the knees.
Right.
If we didn't have this process going on, we wouldn't know where the candidates really stand. But my question to you really is...
Michael Steele, is Rule 15 aspirin between the knees?
Continue. And aspirin someplace else, I think. But anyway.
But really, my question is, how do we square, going forward, how do we square this notion of the delegate count versus the importance of perception and who has the momentum? There's so much talk, for example, that former Governor Mitt Romney has so much momentum because he won the Washington caucuses over the weekend, and that somehow is going to help him in Ohio. But does it really make a difference at all?
Well, it does to a certain degree, but the problem that Romney has, he won Washington with 38%. So, and then you go to Michigan, but for the interesting tinkering of after the fact, very much like we saw in Iowa, with the delegates, that was a split decision. So that was a good example of Romney winning the popular vote, but the delegates were awarded on a congressional district basis, which meant that Santorum won more congressional districts. And so the reality of it is that, this process will lend itself to people sort of second-guessing it and looking at it. But I think the Congressman's point and the point that was Mr. Weed's point is that when you get to the actual allocation of delegates, which won't really happen until you get to the convention, then you'll get a better sense of where they are. Because those caucuses, you've got caucuses that are going to be running and not have their primaries until like late spring, early summer. So this notion of who's got the number, unless you've got a runaway train,
right,
in terms of someone really taking all the numbers, this is going to stay close for quite some time.
Chairman Steele, the question, though, is you talked about getting other voices out there, and that's one of those phrases that has a certain ring to it, and so other people have more of a chance to put themselves into the forum. What have you seen to be the actual impact of that at this particular point? We've got the other voices. We certainly have a more entertaining news cycle, but in terms of who ends up actually running the country or coming close, have we seen results of that yet, or do you expect that we will? Maybe it hasn't been enough time.
I mean, I think you've seen some of it, and really what we were looking at was the idea of, I think someone referenced earlier about how this has all flowed back to the people, back to the base of the party, the activists, the men and women who are the hard chargers and get out there and they get the vote for you and they work. a lot of those folks, or what we'd heard in the past, felt like they were sidelined, that they weren't a part of this, that somehow the nominee was decided by Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina in the month of January, and the rest of us, the other 47 states, just kind of sat there and waited for something, but they didn't know what.
So this is all about democracy.
Right. This gives the base a chance, really, the chance to really be involved in this process, and they have been.
To see it. Okay.
Michael Steele, MSNBC political analyst and former chairman of the Republican National Committee, giving us a wonderful crash course in the rules of the Republican nominating contest. Seriously, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Moderate Republicans edge closer to extinction with the announcement that Maine Senator Olympia Snowe will not run for re-election. Coming up. This past week was not a good week for the nearly extinct so-called moderate Republican. First, there was Republican Senator Scott Brown running for re-election in Deep Blue, Massachusetts, co-sponsoring the Blunt Amendment, which would allow employers and insurers to limit health care coverage based on their own moral objections, whatever those might be. Then Republican Senator Susan Collins of Maine, who is often called a moderate, voted in favor of the Blunt Amendment. Collins' fellow Maine Senator Olympia Snowe was the only Republican who voted against the amendment, and she did so a day after announcing that she wouldn't seek another term, citing, quote, an atmosphere of polarization as one of the reasons. But if you needed any more evidence of what Senator Snowe was referring to, there was Rush Limbaugh's verbal attack on Georgetown law student Sandra Fluke and members of the Republican Party responding to what he had to say.
What does it say about the college co-ed Susan Fluke, who goes before a congressional committee and essentially says that she must be paid to have sex? What does that make her? It makes her a slut, right? Makes her a prostitute.
I still can't get over that sound. Now, you might say, well, Limbaugh is in the business of outrage generation, and you would, of course, be right. This is basically par for the course. But he's also a very, very powerful ideological enforcer on the right. There is a connection between the polarization that Olympia Snowe talked about in that quote, in the trends in voting among Republican House members, and what you just saw in that clip from Rush Limbaugh. He is someone who is almost never crossed, and when he is, it's with delicate diplomatic decorousness. Behold the Republican presidential candidate's bold, unflinching outrage in response to a radio host with vast power and millions of listeners calling a third-year law student a slut.
I'll just say this, which is, it's not the language I would have used. I'm focusing on the issues that I think are significant in the country today.
He's being absurd. I mean, that's, an entertainer can be absurd.
Yesterday, after a number of high-profile sponsors announced they were dropping Limbaugh, Limbaugh issued what he's calling an apology. The statement reads, "For over 20 years, I have illustrated the absurd with absurdity, 3 hours a day, 5 days a week. In this instance, I chose the wrong words in my analogy of the situation. I did not mean a personal attack on Ms. Fluke. My choice of words was not the best. In an attempt to be humorous, I created a national stir. I sincerely apologize to Ms. Fluke for the insulting word choices." Best thing about that statement, it's a hybrid of what Santorum said and what Romney said. Romney said, I would have chose different words. Santorum said he's being absurd, and he just stitched them together into a statement.
What he did.
I think what he's most apologetic about is that he didn't invest $3.95 in a thesaurus to find some synonyms for the words. I think the issue here for Rush Limbaugh is not us around this table.
Clearly.
He is talking to his audience. He's talking to his advertisers. He's talking to the people who syndicate his program. Those are the only people that Rush Limbaugh truly cares about, and so that gives him license to say things like this about third-year college law students.
Right, but the bigger problem, to me, Limbaugh is what he is, right? We know what he is.
What is he? What is he? One of those things he called that woman?
Well, I mean,
what he is, because he sells out for ratings, and he'll say anything, including saying awful things about that woman that were just libelous. Right. For ratings. That makes him somebody who will do something for money.
Right.
But for the candidates.
First of all, I want to say, as a graduate of Georgetown Law School myself, I am very proud of this law student and the way that she has handled it. Aside completely from what Rush Limbaugh says, what does it say about the Republican candidate field, quite frankly? Conventional wisdom is we really shouldn't care what Rush Limbaugh or anyone else says. But he has 20 million voters. He has 20 million listeners to his radio program. Right. This is a question of moral character. It is also a question about what male candidates think about 50% of the population of the United States. Why not say something like it is inappropriate to call anyone a slut?
I watch this happen. I've been watching this happen, and this is fascinating because there was this issue, right, which had to do with the way that the Affordable Care Act, under regulations promulgated by HHS, would interpret the statutory mandate to provide preventative care under the law free of charge. That's where this started.
Yes.
And they interpreted that birth control counted as preventative care, along with a lot of other things like mammograms and things like that. And what happened is the Republicans picked a fight over this, thinking this was a fight about religious freedom. And they keep saying, why is this about birth control? And then people keep cropping up from Foster Friess to Rush Limbaugh to confirm all of the worst fears.
And you know, he absolutely confirmed it. But, this really, for me, isn't about them as candidates. This is about them as fathers and how they would allow someone to talk about their own daughters, their own sisters, their own wives, their own significant others. I think that is the real issue. The issue here is integrity. And when you're running for the White House or any other office in this land, I think that counts above everything else. It matters about, what decision you make on health care, what decision you're going to make. I respect differing policy decisions, but come to it from a position of integrity, and these two candidates showed this week they have none.
Can I just add one thing? I mean, it's a small point, but for people who are interested in women's health, do you know how many millions of women use birth control pills, for example, for something that has nothing to do with contraception?
Absolutely.
If you're going to be knowledgeable about the healthcare system and you're going to say that we care about the healthcare of all Americans and that women's health matters, this argument in and of itself has got to make you very weary of the people running for office.
And we should note that the reason Sandra Fluke is in the center of this is because she was a Georgetown law student and she was going to testify at a House committee hearing about a friend of hers at Georgetown, which of course is a Jesuit institution, does not cover contraception with zero copay, and the friend that she was going to tell the story about is a gay woman, is not using birth control for the reasons that someone else might use birth control, but using it precisely for the health reasons.
Exactly, ovarian cyst.
The grand question here is this, though. Yellow journalism is an old story. There were Rush Limbaughs in the 30s. Yes. There were Rush Limbaughs in the 40s. Now, we are condemning him, as we should. Is the job done, or are we hoping that there will not continue to be people like him who go for the jugular? Because I think we're going to keep seeing him. The advance is that we condemn yellow journalism in a way that it wasn't before. But maybe Rush Limbaugh is the best we can do, in that there will always be people saying terrible things like that to get ratings.
But the question is, will Rush Limbaugh have the last laugh, both in staying on the air? That's a big question. And also in being able to continue to direct the direction of the Republican Party by endorsing primary insurgents against incumbents like our next guest, who's going to join us in a second, Mike Castle, who was defeated by Christine O'Donnell quite famously, I think, in 2010. We're going to ask him about the state of the Republican Party when we come back after this. Michelle Barnard, you told me we were talking about Rush Limbaugh in the green room, and you told me you've had some run-ins with the man in his professional capacity.
Yes.
And I want you to tell me what those have been like, because I think it's a really good microcosm of not just Rush Limbaugh being a jerk, because Rush Limbaugh being a jerk is par for the course, right? But how he acts as this ideological enforcer.
Well, it's really interesting. I will tell you, as the former president of the Conservative Independent Women's Forum, I had several dealings with Rush Limbaugh, and I'm having a very hard time sort of understanding the Rush that I met in private versus the person that we have been hearing about on the radio, for example, over the last week. I will tell you, in all fairness to him, we had a couple of dinners where we honored, for example, Nancy Brinker of the Susan Komen Foundation. Mm-hmm. We honored Condoleezza Rice, who I have great admiration for, and in both of those instances, he actually underwrote those dinners completely, several $100,000 out of his own pocket. So this was a man who I came to know also in private dinners that I have had with him as being quiet, as being very generous, and as someone who no one would ever call an enemy of women. But that being said, there is these times where he comes in as the enforcer. There were times when my capacity as president of the Independent Women's Forum where I might get a phone call from someone who said Rush Limbaugh is upset, for example, that, and I can't verify this because I was not on the conversations, but I would be told Rush Limbaugh was upset or says that you can't be trusted because you said something positive about President Obama. Assuming that to be the case, in the kind of job that I had at that period of time, it makes you feel uncomfortable because you feel, is it possible to say how you really feel about an issue, or do you have to sort of toe the line because this very quote-unquote important person in the conservative movement disagrees with you? I opted to remain true to myself and felt, and quite frankly, a lot of other people in Washington do too, for example, where you will say if a Democrat does something wonderful, you'll say it. If a Democrat does something stupid, you'll say it, and the same thing with Republicans. But there are many people who feel pressure to toe the line and say exactly whatever Rush Limbaugh says is the party line of the day.
I mean, the phone call to me is really remarkable because we all know what he's doing on air.
Yes, but actually, and I have to say, I cannot confirm.
Right.
I can only tell you what I was told, which was he says he can't trust you because you said something positive about Barack Obama.
And he's also gone after you on air. I mean, on his radio show as well.
So I have been told. I did not hear that, but I have been told that. Yes.
Someone else who's felt the wrath of Rush Limbaugh, Mike Castle, former congressman and governor of Delaware, will be our guest right after this.
Look, every day we're using more and more energy.
The world needs more energy.
Where's it going to come from?
That's why right here in Australia, Chevron is building one of the biggest natural gas projects in the world. Enough power for a city the size of Singapore for 50 years.
What's it going to do to the planet?
Natural gas is the cleanest conventional fuel there is.
We've got to be smart about this.
It's the smart way to go.
This is delicious.
Okay.
Is this where we're at now? Just eat whatever tastes good? These sweet honey clusters.
Actually, there's a half a day's worth of fiber in every.
Why stop at cereal? Bring on the pork chops and the hot fudge. Fantastic.
You done, sweetie?
Yeah.
Fiber One.
You know, when I grow up, I'm going to own my own restaurant. I want to be a volunteer firefighter.
When I grow up, I want to write a novel.
I want to go on a road trip.
When I grow up, I'm going to go there.
I want to fix up old houses.
At AARP, we believe you're never done growing.
I want to fall in love again.
Discover what's next in your life. Get this free travel bag when you join at aarp.org/join today.
Even when the economy fizzles, luxury sizzles, and unlikely buyers are pushing big names to new heights. CNBC's Courtney Reagan takes you inside the new business of bling. Luxury boom, the new big spenders, tonight on CNBC.
Right now, I want to bring in Michael Castle, former Republican governor and congressman from Delaware. So wonderful to have you here, Congressman. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Good to be with you.
You are someone who, the story of 2010 and the sort of Tea Party insurgency, which is one data point in a much longer trend of polarization and in increasing ideological extremism, I think, in the Republican Party and Conservative caucus, you were one of the kind of most potent examples of that when you were unseated in a Republican primary in Delaware that I think most observers before the primary thought wouldn't be very contested. Just generally, what do you feel like happened that created the conditions under which you were, in fact, defeated in that primary by Christine O'Donnell?
Well, there was a tremendous amount of energy among those who were her allies, if you will, various Tea Party groups. The Tea Party Express people came in. They're politically pretty competent. They came in and put a lot of money into it, a lot of advertising. Obviously, I wish that we had done more in terms of dealing directly with it, but we did not think it was going to be that big a threat. The polls did not show that, and it happened to be that way. And people like Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and other conservative pundits came strongly on her behalf, and as a result, and the turnout was light, and unfortunately I lost the election unexpectedly to a lot of people, I think, just by people who approached me on the streets in Delaware to tell me that. But it happened, and I think it was a warning for everybody, and perhaps it has helped some of the other candidates. Olympia Snowe unfortunately dropped out, but Dick Lugar and some of the others who are perhaps threatened by this to some degree. They're more prepared for it, perhaps as a result of what happened to me and actually what happened to Lisa Murkowski, in spite of the fact she was able to come back and, of course, win the general election as a write-in candidate.
Well, that's the question I have for you is what message, what was the takeaway of what happened to you in 2010? There was a Times article that showed the voting records of some of the candidates, Orrin Hatch, for instance, who were up for re-election, moving sharply to the right in their election year, precisely, I think, because they're looking over their shoulder and looking at what happened to Lisa Murkowski and to Mike Castle.
Well, my concern, frankly, is that we are losing the center part of politics in America today. And the very people who've been mentioned in this last minute or two are individuals who are willing to talk to both sides, willing to compromise in order to get something done for the good of the country, weren't just worried about the ideological aspects of what was happening or necessarily looking behind their backs at all times, but were willing to sit down and, I think, be good members of the House and Senate. And that's diminishing in two ways. It's diminishing by the fact that a lot of those individuals are choosing not to run. That is Olympia Snowe, for example. Others such as myself and others who were defeated. And then many others who are starting to vote in a much more ideological way, a very conservative way in the case of Republicans. So as a result, you're losing that ability to sit down and work out the differences and make sure that we're progressing the way we need to with respect to the issues of the economy and jobs and the environment and education and those things which are of basic concern to people in America today, regardless of their politics.
We'll talk more about this after the break. Thank you, Congressman. Hello from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. With me this morning, I have Congressman Steve Cohen, Democrat from Tennessee, Michelle Barnard of the Barnard Center for Women, Politics, and Public Policy, and formerly of the Conservative Independent Women's Forum, Goldie Taylor, author of the forthcoming book, An Uncivil War, How America Has Lost Her Collective Grace, and John McWhorter, professor of Linguistic and American Studies at Columbia, as well as a contributing editor at The New Republic and TheRoot.com. Also joining me on satellite is former Republican governor and congressman from Delaware, Michael Castle. Mr. Castle, you made the point just a second ago about the sort of center of politics disintegrating, essentially evaporating, and there's the kinds of people you said who would be willing to kind of be less ideological have left Congress, or they've been beaten, or they've sort of changed their voting behavior. And I hear this a lot, and there's two things I want to respond. One, I myself am kind of an ideologue, so I have some sympathy with the ideologues. But I remember when the ideologues, particularly the Democratic Party, were saying that the Iraq War was a terrible idea, and a lot of pragmatists were saying that we should go ahead and do it. But the other thing is that there is an asymmetrical nature to the polarization that's happening in American politics, and I think this is often not grasped. The Republican Party is becoming much more homogeneous. I can't come up with the word. Homogeneously is becoming much more homogeneously conservative at a much faster rate than the Democrats are becoming homogeneously progressive. And we have some data on this. There's a political scientist run something called DW Nominate. You see those top two lines, which are the Republicans skewing away in the last 20 years, quite radically, right, from the center. Do you feel that? Do you see that asymmetry between what's happening on the conservative side and Republican side and what's happening on the Democratic side?
Yeah, I happen to believe that. There are those who will say it's happening equally in both parties. I don't think that's really the case. I believe the Republicans have suffered more in this. I think you see it in the presidential primaries to a degree also. And part of it's the success of that movement. There is a media support level for all of this. There's a very strong conservative base. The Tea Party groups have actually succeeded. Sometimes in knocking out people in primaries, sometimes in knocking them out and getting their candidates advanced and getting their candidates elected. And so I think you see it very strongly in the Republican Party, and I think it's a lot of the split now in the presidential primaries. I think Romney is viewed as not as conservative as the others, for example.
Mike, there's no question if the party bosses we talked about earlier were more involved in selections, Mike Castle would have been the nominee, and he'd be the senator.
Right.
And probably Harry Reid would not have won in Nevada. And I'm happy as a Democrat that we've got 2 seats. Mike, I'm sorry, but I'm a Democrat. But for the Republicans, they would have 2 people, and they don't have those. And when I've seen the time I've been in the House, I've seen Wayne Gilchrist lose. I've seen Phil English lose, who were people that could vote a different way. And you can only X amount of people that you'd see that would ever vote opposite the party line. And there's Jimmy Duncan occasionally on some issues, and Ron Paul always marches to his own drum. But there's just the moderate.
Well,
and the Democratic side, the Blue Dogs have disappeared since I've been there.
But I want to go back to what you just said, because this seems a fundamental point to me. You just said if the party bosses were more in control, right, they're retaining the seat. And so much of the conversation about polarization seems to me to end up in this somewhat elitist place that says the problem is the rabble are having too much effect on our political process, and the party bosses aren't controlling things enough. And that strikes me as deeply anti-democratic.
It's not. I wouldn't say rabble, obviously. The ideologues, the extremists.
Right.
And we've got to win, you've got to come to the center. President Obama knows that. The Republican Party leaders know that. But the activists don't. And they're looking at the world more myopically. And they're not looking at the picture of winning the White House. And so what you could have in Tampa is just a bunch of folks walking off a pier into the Gulf of Mexico.
Mr. Castle, I have a question. When I was a lad, I seem to remember in the 70s, call it about 1975, people sitting around in leisure suits, people who considered themselves good liberals, saying that there was a serious drift among a considerable segment of the Democrats too far to the left, and that there was a problem and that something needed to be done about these extremes taking over those Democrats who weren't part of the old southern wing of it that we won't talk about. That changed. How is it different now with Republicans? Am I being a little too Pollyanna-ish to see that the Republicans are at the point where we can assume that in about 10 years will change, just like did for the Democrats about the things that people were complaining about while having fondue parties, et cetera, in 75 and 76? What's the difference?
Well, I'm not sure I totally understand it all. If I did, perhaps I'd be in the Senate right now. But I would just say this. I think that the Republicans probably have learned a few lessons, in terms of not just my defeat, but as I said, Lisa Murkowski's primary defeat and in other circumstances. You see people dropping out, and I'm not sure why Olympia dropped out. I happen to believe her that it's because of the frustration not being able to get things done in the Senate today. But, I mean, there's a person who would be in the middle, and so that's a problem. And until the Republicans realize, hey, we cannot just win and control, for example, the United States Senate with all conservatives, the Republican Party is going to have a problem. There's got to be a greater belief that we've got to elect Republicans who may not be quite like what we want ideologically, but fit the mold of voting for Republicans. Just like Steve said, he's a Democrat, and I understand that, and I'm a Republican. And I mean, I look at the Senate circumstance now, and Maine is going to be very difficult for Republicans to hold. And now you have Bob Kerrey coming back in Nebraska. So as a result, there was a lot of talk about Republicans taking over the Senate. Now it's going to be a lot higher mountain to climb than it was before this week. And so as a result, you're getting some losses that way. And there are seats throughout the country, and Massachusetts Senate race is one of them, and a few others in which you're not going to elect a pure conservative Republican. But that Republican, if he or she is elected in a more moderate leaning district, if you will, is going to help the party with some procedural votes or whatever it may be. And there needs to be an understanding you're going to have a blend if you're going to be a majority party. If you just want to have your ideological beliefs, fine. You can keep on supporting the absolute most conservative candidate, have them get nominated, and in many instances defeated.
Mr. Castle,
I think the party needs to look carefully at that.
Mr. Castle, this is Goldie Taylor. I have to ask you, and looking back, when I was a lad in '75, wasn't this just wholly predictable that, with the New Southern strategy that came around and then the contract with or on America, whichever party you think you belong to, wasn't this sort of wholly predictable, this ideological divide exacerbated by a president who happened to be of color, sort of pulling the sheets off of everything. I didn't mean it that way.
No pun
intended. But wasn't this sort of wholly predictable? And where does it leave us when there's no room in our Congress for a Olympia Snowe or for, say, a Sam Nunn Democrat or sort of the Blue Dogs when the middle is ripped out? Is there room for change, incremental or otherwise, to move this country forward? I mean, doesn't the strength of this nation lie in its middle?
I think it does. And I'm not sure it was wholly predictable. I mean, it was obviously a movement that was happening and it was going in that direction. But on the other hand, the politics of 2 years ago with the organization of the various Tea Party type groups, if you will, and the money that was poured into that has made a big difference. I think these super PACs, which I do not support in any way, are making a big difference and will in both parties, as a matter of fact, as far as the future of politics is concerned, unless the Supreme Court does something else with the Citizens United case. And it's being played to by, frankly, what we're doing right now, by cable television to a degree. As I said, the Rush Limbaughs and the Sean Hannitys of the world, who take very strong political viewpoints in their pronouncements. It's beyond just reporting of news. It is strident politics that's going on there, and that's making a difference too. So that was sort of, it was coming, but it was sort of unseen to a degree, and it is there. It has worked. As I said, it's worked not just in those who are no longer in service in the Congress of the United States, but in how they're voting. To some degree, you've got to follow the party line. If you don't, you're going to get castigated. People are now taking any particular vote, as Steve knows, as anyone in Congress knows, and they're finding the downside of it, and they're saying that this member of Congress voted for or against something that they shouldn't have, even if it was basically a decent piece of legislation. Maybe it spent too much money or something of that nature, and they're going to go after it. And people are becoming extremely defensive in terms of how they're voting, and they're worried about getting too far away from their party following, and particularly I think that's true in the Republican Party. I think it's somewhat true in the Democratic Party too. It's just a problem, and so people can't sit down and say, let's work out a compromise, say on education, for example. If No Child Left Behind is problematical right now, as many people believe, can we do something to replace that? And that's not yet been worked out, and yet it should. Can we do something about the cost of Social Security and Medicare? Can we do something about tax reform? These are basic issues that are going to have to take the sitting down and working on them together. And it's going to take Republicans and Democrats to do it, and a president who's willing to work with them. And it's just simply not happening right now, and it's frustrating, I think, to the average American.
One issue I would add to that as well is climate change, actually, what I think is the most important and the thing that most requires some kind of bipartisan consensus, because it represents such a massive challenge and requires such a reorientation of sort of our policy. That's something that you were definitely attacked for in the primary. Michael Castle, former Republican governor and congressman from Delaware, thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much.
All right, did redistricting kill bipartisanship in Congress? We'll talk about it. All right, so we're talking about polarization. I wanted to just sort of get something off my chest, because we have this conversation about polarization, and there's a certain track that it goes on, right, which is, oh, this is such a bummer that the American people are polarized and the people in Congress who can talk to each other like Mike Castle are gone, and we're missing the center. And there's a few things I think that are really important to keep in mind. First of all, the bipartisanship of the bygone era was largely a relic of a bizarre anomaly of American politics that had to do with Democrats in the South. There was a contingency of Democrats in the South who were essentially conservatives, but also Democrats,
Democrats, and that was because white Southerners hated Abraham Lincoln for the fact that he waged the Civil War and freed the slaves, and that permeated all throughout much of the 20th century, and only in the last 20 years has the ideological regional realignment happened that was actually there underlying the whole time, right? Realignment has happened, but that was always there. It was just that through happenstance, because of the contingent affiliation of the party in power during the Civil War, that you had this, right? So that's one thing. Second thing is, parliamentary politics are not bad. The problem is that we have a mismatch between the increasing parliamentary behavior of Congress, which votes in party blocks, and the institutional structure of the country, which is not set up in a parliamentary system. It is set up through the House and the Senate with a system of checks and balances to essentially frustrate the will of the majority in all kinds of ways. There's all sorts of anti-majoritarian institutions in place. So we feel like the system is dysfunctional because there's a mismatch between the party behavior, which is parliamentary in its nature, increasingly so, and the institutional setup, which is not that. And then finally, let me just say this about bipartisanship. No, because this is really important. Bipartisan bills. What are the big bipartisan bills of the last decade? The TARP bailout and the Iraq war vote, right? The Afghanistan adventure, which now exists 10 years later and continues to show no sign of stopping.
Exactly 10 years.
Exactly 10 years, which voted with one dissenting vote in the entire House, right? So, yes, bipartisanship is possible, but when you point to what are the big benefits of bipartisanship, you get 2 wars and a bailout as 3 of the biggest bipartisan things.
But if you look back, though, if you go back,
bring it on.
That's right.
NAFTA, No Child Left Behind, which
but everybody hates No Child Left Behind now.
I don't. I think if you live in a low-income area and your child is stuck in an underperforming school, finally there is a national debate about education. But even going back before that, NAFTA. Very important piece of bipartisan legislation. I like NAFTA. I believe in free trade. I know. I see the smirk on your face. I know you feel nauseous, but I'm just
not nauseous. I just disagree. But continue.
And welfare reform.
I was going to say welfare reform.
Bipartisanship. Very important piece of legislation.
That was in the 90s.
Oh, I don't know.
I said let's go back.
No, but I'm saying the last
another 10 years.
I don't know.
Yeah. You see a lot of bipartisanship, or you should in committees. And you're not seeing that now. The work product that comes out of committees in the House that then goes to the floor can be bipartisan and small. Transportation bill was always bipartisan. This year, extremely partisan. No Democrat in the House voted for the transportation bill, and it's basically dead on arrival. They're going to go with the Senate bill because the House bill was too far out. And you had the Tea Party people that spent too much money, and some of them were against the bill when it came out, but they wouldn't accept any Democratic alternatives, and they were against mass transit, and it was an ideological fight. And you see that in the committees all the time now.
That's interesting. So the committee process is a place in which there was a kind of bipartisanship that wasn't the kind of bipartisanship I'm talking about, but actually just a sort of an actual day-to-day working together relationship.
The ranking member and the chairman would work together to bring about a bill. And each member would work through their ranking member or through their chairman to get their legislation into it, and you'd get a bill that everybody could support, particularly in transportation. That doesn't happen anymore. It didn't happen here. And when you're blaming the Democrats with the Dixiecrats and saying they hated Lincoln, well, that's here and there and blah, blah, blah. But how about what happened to the Scrantons and the Percys and the Rockefellers and the Romneys of the 1960s?
Right.
Those moderate Republicans don't exist either.
Absolutely.
And that wasn't because they hated Andrew Johnson.
They can't exist. If they do exist, they're in the closet. They can't exist.
Let's press on this regional aspect to it, because I think that's a big part of it. And that there's no doubt that polarization is part of our current political climate. And many people believe one of the crucial drivers is congressional gerrymandering, which, of course, is when lawmakers draw the borders of districts to avoid the neighborhoods of people most likely to vote against their party. Here's a young United States senator making precisely this point in 2006.
Too many districts today, people's vote really probably won't make a difference. I know that's sacrilege to say, but as a consequence of the gerrymandering of congressional districts, people aren't being illogical when they stay at home because the outcome is a foregone conclusion.
That's, of course, now President Barack Obama talking about this gerrymandering and the way that we're in the midst of redistricting right now, and it's a very fraught thing. There's a lawsuit that the Department of Justice has contested the redistricting plan that Texas has proposed as violating the Voting Rights Act. Do you on the ideological front, I mean, you're in what we would call, I think, a safe district in terms of...
I think so, but I've got a man who's going to spend $5 million to lose to me.
Really?
Yeah, a doctor, Republican.
I like that trash talk, by the way. I love it. Bring it.
Spend $5 million to try to beat me. And he can bring $10 million. Bring it on.
Well, but
I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
But tell me, Congressman, tell me about, do you agree with the underlying premise there about the way in which gerrymandering produces ideological division? You hear a lot of this in the House. People in the House are not in contested districts. I know my own personal experience. I lived on the west side of Chicago. I now live in Park Slope. I've never been in a contested congressional district in my life. Do you think that's part of it?
That's definitely part of it, and this happens in the states too. The idea that the politicians make up the playing field for them to play in is wrong. There should be some independent group that makes up the boundaries and the game, or the parameters. Some states have commissions. California has it. And so for the first time ever, you've seen contested primaries, contested elections in California, and it's going to put a Howard Berman against an incumbent member, Brad Sherman, and you're going to see other things like that and people retiring. But California districts are going to be more representative, and it's going to be, elections can be decided in November. Right now, most elections are determined in the primaries, and so you play to your base, and that's when you win, and you don't play to the center at all. In a state legislative seats, Tennessee has gone totally Republican because the districts were drawn to where the Republicans had the districts, and so that it happens, and it does not make for the better people. John Tanner had a bill who was a blue dog, who was a great blue dog, and it said that every state, I've taken up the bill, Schuler had it, he left too because he felt like he was too far. But the bill needs to pass to say that each state's redistricting should be made with a commission, a nonpartisan commission, maybe named by the governor, three from each party or something like that.
Let me just insert that the political scientists there's a literature now around gerrymandering and partisan polarization, and it's pretty inconclusive. I mean, it's unclear that is really driving it. Iowa has commissions, and we still get Steve King coming out of Iowa, so it's not necessarily a silver bullet. I just want to.
Well, I think the congressman is right about this. I have been in the Georgia State House grappling with maps, and there is one goal and one goal only, and it is to consolidate power and get a map that will pass the court test.
Right. Particularly in a state like Georgia.
Ironically enough, it was Newt Gingrich, who was more of a father of Republican Party in Georgia, and the late Paul Coverdale, who ushered this change in maps that allow many more Republicans in the state to be elected. We've got one Democratic Congressman, David Scott, whose district snakes around the bottom of Atlanta this way, that collects as many African-American voters as possible so that he can be in a safe district while, handing over 7 or 8 other districts to Republicans.
And you point out something that I think is so crucial that you, Congressman Cohen, are in a unique position to tell us about, which is there was for a while, particularly starting, I think, in the 80s and 90s, this kind of coincidence of interest between white Republicans and black Democrats in the South. Because if you can load a lot of African-American solid Democratic voters into districts and make a bunch of majority-minority districts, which, of course, obviously African-American legislators like, and they have every right to, of course, then you also are you're consolidating Republican power.
What's happening is white Democrats are disappearing from the table across the South, and the people who are negotiating are black Democrats and white Republicans, and that's where, the stuff is.
And it polarizes. It happened in my community. They took a part of my district out, and part of it, I think, is to get rid of the Democratic Party as white Democrats in Memphis, Tennessee, and make it black and white, and give the whites the reason to think they should vote Republican. Right. And so it goes to base. And you said earlier about Romney, he'll have to do it, and we'll do it. But, it's awful, and you shouldn't have that. There was an article in The Nation, I think Ari Berman wrote it.
Yeah, let's show it. It's great piece, resegregating the South.
And he said the Republicans said what their project was in doing this was Operation Rat, a 4-letter word that deals with reproduction.
Right.
What an awful thing for them to say that was their program to get rid of white Democrats.
Here's a great quote from this State Senator Eric Mansfield, who is a black Democrat in North Carolina, saying we're having the same conversation we had 40 years ago in the South, that black people can only represent black people and white people can only represent white people. I'd hope that in 2012 we'd have grown better than that. More about racialized gerrymandering and ideological sorting right after this break.
Yeah.
All right, the one thing we know about gerrymandering is that because of the process, it's the lawmakers who choose the voters and not the other way around. Reminds me of that old Bertolt Brecht thing about the Communist Party dissolving the people and electing another. Another way for politicians to choose the people who vote for them is by suppressing votes through legislation like voter ID laws. Right now, I want to bring in the Reverend Al Sharpton, host of Politics Nation on a network called MSNBC you may have heard of. He's also founder and president of the civil rights organization National Action Network. He and the organization are leading a march beginning today from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery in support of voter rights. Rev, how you doing?
Good morning. How you doing, Chris?
I'm doing good. I like that tie. We've been talking about the ways in which racialized gerrymandering is also part of the equation when you look at essentially working to dilute or concentrate in ways and then dilute the voting power of African Americans in the South.
No doubt about it. And it's not only in the South, it's in the North as well. You must remember in '65 in the Voting Rights Act, it also included New York. Before I left New York yesterday, we were dealing with questions of the redistricting, what's going to happen to the Harlem district, for example. So this has been a national problem. When you combine that with, as you said, the voter ID laws that we're marching about today and all this week, it is a real critical point in where we're dealing with how will the concentrated black vote demonstrate itself both locally with congressional fights and then nationally where you're going to have a disproportionate amount disqualified from voting if they don't have the proper state ID or if they were depending on long-term early voting, which has now been shortened in some states, ending Sunday voting. So that is why we are marching this week, because this is the first time in 47 years since the Voting Rights Act that we've seen such a serious affront on the rights of blacks to vote. And in many ways trying to come up with a solution to a problem that doesn't exist, and that is when they try to say that they're doing this for voter fraud.
Reverend Sharpton, I have to ask you a question. This is John McWhorter. I'm so glad I can actually post this question to you directly. I understand the problem with voter ID. I've written against these efforts to disenfranchise black voters. But here's one solution that I would use if somebody put this kind of power in my hands. Why can't we get the word out in the black community to get the proper ID? Why can't we devote ourselves to this in a long-term and visceral fashion so that people can't pull it? Isn't there room for that being as important as contesting the nasty sorts of things?
Well, I think, John, you took my speech from me today. I think that we have to have.
What a morning
I think we have to have a two-lane strategy. The two lanes are one, we must fight where we can, but at the same time, with National Action Network, Urban League, and ACP, all of us are going to do is have a B strategy to make sure that churches and others, Black Radio, mobilize to put ID in people's hands, including where we have to raise the money and buy them through the churches. Right. So I don't think it's an either or, it's a both and, which is why we're highlighting the problem with the march, but we've got to solve it, but at the same time, not concede it. It can't be where we're doing where we're going to fall on the sword and say, you're going to stop the laws or we're not voting. We're going to do both and. Right. And I'm going to tell them that you told me to do it, John.
John McWhorter, professor at Columbia University, just told me this morning on cable news. Michelle Barnard.
Reverend Sharpton, it's Michelle Barnard. Quick comment I wanted to throw out there because I find it interesting. I was actually speaking with William Harvey. He's the president of Hampton University, which is a historically black college and university. A few weeks ago, we were talking literally about this issue, and what he said to me was, well, what's the big deal? Go out and get an ID. And I just want to throw that out there, that as you are working with black voters to make sure people get registered to vote, please make sure you hit up our historically black colleges and universities throughout the country. But my question that I wanted to pose to you as well is, when we think about the atrocity that we see happening with voter suppression of African American voters across the country, it leads me back to the question, which is, do we as African Americans do ourselves a disservice by overwhelmingly self-identifying as Democrats rather than deciding that we should either register to vote as Republicans or at least self-identify as independents, so that both the Republican and the Democratic Party have incentive to go out and prove that they have the best interests of African Americans at heart and give us a reason to vote for them?
Well, I think that, let me deal with your first question first. I think, as I said to John, we must do both and I know Dr. Harvey well. My daughter went to Hampton. But the issue of should we register wholly as Democrat or Republican or independent, we ought to register in wherever our interests are going to be served. The problem that with Republicans, to me, is not that we should all be Democrats or Republicans. The problems are that Republicans must lay out some political advantages for African Americans, just as they appeal to Latinos or women or any other group. If you remember in 2004, when I addressed the Democratic Convention, I said, we'll ride this donkey as far as it'll take us. If the donkey won't take us and the elephant will, let's go there. But I'm not going to get on the elephant if it's going to sit on me and not bring me somewhere. We're not dealing with the Republican Party that of Arthur Fletcher, of Jackie Robinson, of even Nelson Rockefeller, or of others like that we've seen, like Jack Kemp. So if this party is a party of calling people food stamp presidents and all, then it's no wonder people are not going to go there. Or if they're anti-immigrant, then why would the Latino community go there? They must talk our interests. They should not just say you ought to have an alternative if those alternatives is not alternative interest-based, just alternative party-based.
Reverend Al Sharpton, thank you so much for taking a little time. I'm going to let you get back to putting the finishing touches on the march down there. Host of Politics Nation on MSNBC, founder and president of the Civil Rights Organization.
All right, thank you, Chris.
Take care, Rev. We'll be right back, talk more about votes in the South and race.